Hey, it's Tom Pankhurst for JAK, and we're going to be checking out 5 things that you can use your OXBox for, which are slightly unconventional, or some new uses that you might not have thought about. If you're interested in just those 5 things, skip ahead, I'll see you there. But for now, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of what the OXBox is if you're unsure. So Universal Audio's OXBox is essentially a loadbox and amp attenuator, but with a host of effects built in and really top of the range algorithmic replications of how cabs work. It's algorithm based as opposed to IR based, IR standing for impulse response. Some other manufacturers of other boxes will use IR based things. Those are essentially, I'm not going to bore you with that, but those are essentially captures of how an amp responds in a certain situation. One of the problems with using IRs though is that they are just a snapshot of how that amp responds with a certain amount of power going through it and a certain, like how it was set up in the room with the microphones and all those things. So what UA have done is they've essentially removed any of that IR stuff and they've replaced it with really, really high-end algorithms of the way that speakers respond in the different ways that they've been driven. So if you're considering something that is way cheaper than the OXBox, and you're wondering why something like this is a little bit more expensive, it's because you're getting something that no other box is essentially doing, and I'm going to explain to you why that makes a difference. So in layman's terms, what you would use a loadbox for is essentially taking the power from your amp. So you've got an amp head. We're currently using the Paul Reed Smith MT15, and we've got that going into the back of the loadbox, direct out from the 8 ohm output into the 8 ohm input on the back. So if you think about an amp head, that's going to be kicking out a huge amount of power to be able to move speakers physically, and that's how you make noise. What a loadbox does in layman's terms is it absorbs the power, which means that it gives you the purely dry signal of exactly how that amp is working and allows you to fiddle around with that. Inside the OXBox, there is a dynamic impedance curve, which means that when you're cranking your amp, you will put out more power, your amp will be putting out more juice. The OXBox will respond to that in the way that a cab would actually respond to it, as opposed to just being a fixed impedance curve. The difference in that is in the way that it dynamically responds. When you push a cab really hard, the speakers move around, there's all sorts of things going on. When you're just using an IR and pushing that, that's just a capture of how that speaker moved at that one point. What the OXBox does is it essentially simulates, using their algorithms, the way that the cab responds to a higher output of an amp and when you roll off and push the amp a little bit more. That means that algorithmically, UA have considered things like the volume of air inside each of the cabs that they've got, the way the speaker moves, the foam around the speaker and the way that that's attached and the way that that vibrates. They've even done things like enable you to dial in exactly how old the speaker is and the sort of wear you get, and you notice that in the transient or the front end of your attack. And that's a really cool feature to have control over. So you don't have direct control over all these parameters. These are just things that UA have considered when making their algorithms, and they've baked them into the way that the cab actually responds, so it actually responds dynamically. They've included 22 cabinets in the OXBox currently. They previously expanded it to put in some like 4x12s with V30s for more rock orientated players. It's quite a 70s looking unit, but they've made it as modern as they can. The OXBox is controlled using the UA app, which is available for iPads and desktops. So within that app, you've got control over what sort of microphone you've got on each of the 22 cabinets. So you choose a cabinet and then you can choose the microphone. You've got 2 microphone placements within the app. So you could choose maybe an SM57 on one, and you could use a ribbon, which is, I think, the 121, which is the Royal 121. And you can blend those as you see fit. There's also the option to include room mics as well, which is something that's really handy. The app also includes a host of effects, which include a EQ, which is pretty standard. We've got a 1176 compressor, which is going to be great news if you're a fan of those sort of Neve style things and studio outboard gear. You've got a delay, and you've also got a fantastic plate reverb. Don't worry though if you are gigging, because you don't need the app to operate this once it's set in and saved as presets. So here's a brief overview of what the unit actually has on the outside in terms of its functionality. We've got a headphone jack, which is going to be really helpful when it comes to practicing at home. We've also got the line out, that's going to control the level of your two line outs that you have on the back, which can go to your DAW or front of house. The next one is speaker volume. This one is the level of attenuation that's going on. So you could use the OXBox in between your amp head and a cab because it has a through out the back. So you plug your head into the OXBox then has a speaker out, and that can go to your cab normally. What this means is you can control the amount of power coming out and therefore the volume of your cab. One thing to note with this, which is really useful, is that UA have considered the way that human hearing works and the way that cabs respond when they don't have as much power going into them or they're at lower volumes. Typically, when you drive a cab harder, it's going to produce a lot more bass, and that's going to be way more noticeable to a human ear. When you got it at low volumes, you typically don't get that bass response. Have you ever wondered why you need to crank up the EQ on like a small amp when you're using it? It's because of these reasons. You're not being able to move that amount of air out of the cabinet. So UA have included an EQ curve on their attenuator, which means that the higher you attenuate it, it just brings up that low end a little bit better. And that's going to mean that if you're practicing at home and you don't particularly want to keep fiddling with your EQ, you can just use the attenuator to roughly simulate what it would be like if it was cranked. The next one is going to be the room, and that is going to control the amount of room mic that you have in it. If you're practicing with headphones, you might want to crank this up a little bit more, and you'll notice it more with headphones, because if you're practicing in a room, you're typically hearing the sound bouncing off the walls, and that's going to your ears. When you're going direct into some headphones into a loadbox or a cabinet sim, you're not going to be able to get any of that, and so therefore it sounds quite different. You can work your way around this by just adjusting the amount of room that you have on the box, and that's something that's really useful, and obviously they want you to fiddle with because it's right on the front. Next to that, we have the rig option, and that's where you can store 6 presets that you can easily go between for easy access. On the back, you've got some pretty standard ins and outs. You've obviously got that input from the head, so that's where that input goes. You've got 2 line outs, and those are TRS, which means that they are balanced, and that means that you are going to get a really high level quality of signal that you can then send off to your front of house, or you can then plug into your interface if you're working at home. There's also options for SPDIF, which is going to be great because then you're going to be essentially losing one stage of conversion. So if you're really concerned about stacking preamps and the amount of analog to digital conversion, you can just use SPDIF. And then there's also the option for a foot switch, and that is going to be really useful, and we're going to get into that in a bit. So let's get into some novel uses of this unit. Number 1, you can use this thing purely as a load box. Almost every review I've seen of these online, everyone's used the cabinet emulation that's going on in it, mostly because it's fantastic. But I hear you if you're saying, I've got some IRs, I love them. Can this thing just do direct stuff? Because I just want to take advantage of those things that are inside it. So you've got that dynamic impedance curve, the way it responds, it's just that little bit better potentially than other load boxes that you might have considered. So the way you do that is under the microphone settings, you can actually set it up as a direct box. All you need to do then is just pan that to one side, and then you could run that as like your left channel, and then that will come out obviously into one of your preamps that you have on your interface. You can then apply an IR onto that. So you could essentially run this direct in, so you've got the freedom to mess around with any of the IRs that you need. It's essentially like reamping, but for cabs. And then on the other one, you could have a tone that you're really happy with from the OXBox. So you could have flexibility on one side and a tone that you've committed to on the other one. We just thought it was a really useful thing. No one really talks about it in relation to the OXBox, so it's something worth mentioning. The second use we thought of is using a foot switch for solo boosts and effects sections. So you can assign effects to be controlled by the foot switch that you can use on the back. And what this means is, if your amp doesn't have an effects loop, or you really like the sound of where your preamp is currently before an output stage, you can use the OXBox to boost that signal essentially using the EQ or the compressor. If you're running a high gain amp, that effects section is going to be really useful. Typically, when you use high gain, you don't put reverb in front of the high gain, otherwise it becomes this washed out mess. If you've got an amp that doesn't have reverb, you just go into the OXBox. The OXBox will provide that, and you can send that off to front of house if you needed to. You can also turn that on and off with the foot switch, but you could also use that EQ, as I said, to put that on at the same time and put the EQ on to boost it just for solos, which means that instead of using a boost in front of your amp or in your signal chain of your preamp, you're not going to be affecting the sound too much, because you're literally just raising the output on your end before it hits front of house, which means that you're essentially just getting the same sound but louder. So the third use we thought of is kind of an obvious one, but we just want to reiterate this point, and it's something that's really useful. You can adjust the speaker drive to affect the way your amp responds. So if you are a metal player, you're using like a V30 style speaker because you want that tightness, great, keep the speaker drive down all the way to the left, and you're going to be able to get some great response out of that with like nice snappy tones. If you're a blues player, you probably don't want that so much. So you could roll that speaker drive all the way to the right, and then you're going to be able to get the effects of an aged speaker, something that's been pushed harder, and you'll notice that when that speaker is driven a little bit more, it kind of naturally compresses a little bit, and you notice that your transient attack is slightly different. So it's a little bit spongier. It's not something you could necessarily always tell is going on, but it genuinely affects the way it feels, because I know that's really important. So when you're playing, like, you want that nice snappy response, you can feel that when you play immediately from the feedback. When you're playing some like bluesy solo-y sorts of things, dial it to the right, it feels a little bit spongier, and you can feel that under your fingertips. So the fourth use we thought of is using the attenuator to affect the way that low tunings feel. So this might not necessarily be something that you consider when you're recording, but if you're practicing at home and you're wondering which load box to look at, I definitely point you towards this. And the reason for that is that because of the way the attenuator works on the UA, it obviously has that EQ thing going on that I mentioned previously. If you skip to this, it might be worth going back. You might learn some things, maybe, maybe not. But because it boosts that bass at low volume, when you're playing some of those metal things, you can really hear it when you're low tuned. We didn't demonstrate this at the moment because I'm using a Strat, but I was playing around with this at home, and I did notice that when I was playing on my 7-string in particular, when I was using a cab, it was something that was quite noticeable, and it really did affect the way that I was playing because there was just that little bit more of like low-end presence there, and that was really cool. So number 5, and the last one that I thought of in a weird way to use it and potentially expand the flexibility of the unit, is to do with the way that your outputs are set up. So if you took the 2 outputs and ran those both into a Y box before sending it to front of house, you could essentially send front of house one signal, and you could swap between the 2 outputs of the OXBox by just using the Y box. And here's the use of that. If you're just using one preset, you could take the left-hand side setup as a 57 on a V30, let's say, and then on the right-hand side, you could use a completely different microphone and therefore get a different cab character. Let's say you're gigging and you're doing a lot of rhythm work, and that's great, and you want to keep your sound pretty much the same the whole time. You're using the 57. When it gets to doing a big epic lead for one section of the track, or any leads that you're doing, you can swap to essentially a different cab sound without changing the preset by just stomping on a Y box or having that as part of your signal chain. And that means that if you're playing rhythm and you've got that 57 sound, you need that slightly different character to push through or blend with other amps, particularly if there's another guitarist in the band, then you can use this Y box to just get a different character without having to twiddle any knobs or anything. It's just on the floor. So that was the OXBox from Universal Audio. I think this thing's great. Honestly, when I noticed the difference between this and another loadbox that I've been using, you really did notice the dynamic response. It's really hard to explain what that feels like on a video, and obviously when you're hearing it in a video as well, that's going to be difficult to just sort of compare. And I'm sure other people have probably done some reviews on that, so it might be worth checking out other things if you are interested. You know, let us know what you think though. Like, could you notice the difference? Would you consider getting one of these over the previously existing things? Are there things we missed out? Are there some other really cool uses that you've thought of that you would like to drop in the comments and let us know? That would be great. Yeah, just let us know what you think of the things that we came up with. And there's obviously some pretty standard ways you can use a loadbox. So it's, you know, just giving you some different things to try out. Let us know what you think though. If you enjoyed the video, please leave us a like, subscribe to see more things like this, and I'll see you next time.